Well, hello, everybody, both in person and on Zoom. My name is Maria. I work here at the Quabbin Visitor Center, and we're excited to offer another one of our hybrid presentations. Today, we have Karen Traub with the Swift River Valley Historical Society, and she has a really, what I know is going to be a really fascinating presentation about a signature quilt from Prescott. So with no further ado, here is Karen.
Thank you very much. And hello to people online at home. I'd like to start today, before I talk about the quilt, I would like to test my volume. Is that good in the back? Everybody can hear? Okay. And I'd like to start by reading a poem. And this poem is called Leaving Home. A poem written by Mrs. Lillian E. Gross, Prescott, Massachusetts, February 17th, 1927. They tell us we must leave our homes, these places we hold so dear. Though here we've lived and played and worked these many, many a year. We love these rugged tree-clad hills, the meadows in between, the orchards and the pleasant vales, where shines the summer's green. We love the fields our fathers tilled, the flowers and shrubs and vines, the sound of rustling through the oak, the whisper of the pines. 'Tis hard to transplant men and trees when they have come full grown. Their roots grow deep down in the soil that they have made their own. By right of eminent domain, bring forth the cherished deed whereby you thought to keep your home as long as you should need. Where shall we find another place, our weary feet to rest? Shall we go north or south or east, or shall we wander west? I feel like there's some poignancy to that poem. In these times, it was written, as I said, on February 17th, 1927, and that was just after the Swift River Act was passed, and people knew that their ability to live in their beautiful valley was coming to an end. Now, I live in the town of Shutesbury, and on February 14th of that same year of 1927, Shutesbury town meeting passed Article 20, a vote of sympathy to the Swift River towns for them in their compulsory abandonment of their homes because of proposed flooding. Extend invitation to establish new homes in our community. I found that so sweet. And the reason that I wanted to start with that is, well, for one thing, that poem was written by Lillian Gross, who is one of the names in the quilt. But also just kind of thinking about how sad it was when the people of the Swift River towns had to leave their homes, and that they cared for one another. This was such a strong community where people really looked out for each other. So my next slide is, let's see, advance. Okay, so who am I? Like I said, I'm Karen Traub, and I am, among other things, a docent at the Swift River Valley Historical Society, which is a museum, and it's the holder of the memories of the people of the Swift River Valley. Are most of you familiar with we call it the museum, we call it SRVHS because it's so long to say Swift River Valley Historical Society. But we are a museum that's open to the public from June until September on Wednesday and Sunday afternoons. And this is where you'll find this quilt in its glory hanging on the stairway at the Whitaker Clary House. So if you want to visit, you can come when the museum is open. You can also contact Dot Fry, who is the administrator of the museum, and make an appointment if you wanted to visit. And I just want to give a huge shout out to the museum because, first of all, that's where I found out about the quilt, and it has led me to all this wonderful research There's a fabulous archive of material at the museum. I'm really grateful to the people who have done research on this quilt before me. It made my work a lot easier. And in case anybody wants to donate or become a volunteer, you're always welcome to join as a friend of the museum. So the Prescott signature quilt was made in 1895. We know that because some of the signatures have the date 1895 on it. The mystery is who made this quilt, why did they make it, and how did it end up in the Hitchcock Chair Museum in Riverton, Connecticut? So I've set about finding out what I can about this quilt, and we'll find out at the end whether or not I did solve the mystery. But in order to get started, I just wanted to start with that mystery. The curator of the museum, the Hitchcock Museum, was sworn to secrecy as to how the quilt came into the possession of the museum. So that was a mystery that really kind of drew me in and intrigued me. So I'll give a little bit of background about the research that has been done, what we know about the quilt, and then we'll see if I have solved the mystery or not. So this is the tag that is on the quilt at the museum, and this gives the information, the little story that I just said, that somebody, I believe it was a woman named Helen Canny, was visiting that museum, and she came across this quilt, and she's like, I know that person. She was reading the names. I know that that's my great grandmother. That Helen is related to a lot of the people in the quilt. And she was instrumental in its coming back to the museum. Audrey Dukert and Eleanor Griswold Schmidt went down to the Chair Museum, and they were the ones that negotiated with the proprietors of the museum. What do you mean you can't tell us how it got here? These are Prescott people. Well, if you can't tell us how it got here, can we buy this? Can we buy this quilt? And for an undisclosed price, they purchased the quilt and they brought it back to the Swift River Museum, where it belongs and where it is today. And I just want to note that this card was written by Elizabeth Pierce, Zib Pierce, who is one of the historians of the Swift River Museum. Let's see, and I want to give my thank yous. I'm going to go through, there are slides acknowledging the good work of the mostly women who have done the preliminary research that not only preserved this quilt, but got some of the background information about who these people in the quilt are. So I'm going to go through those slides. And also I want to give a shout out, of course, to the Swift River Valley Historical Society. The Friends of Quabbin is a wonderful organization, and they have many really valuable resources for information if you're doing any kind of research. I also want to mention that they are doing a special project. They are fundraising to help restore the Keystone Bridge. And if anybody's interested in that, do pick up the Friends of Quabbin newsletter. It's on the tables here, and you can find out more about getting involved in that. UMass, the UMass Special Collections is a treasure chest of information about the towns of the Swift River Valley, and a lot of their information is available online on through their website. The Internet Archive is the world's library. Anything you want to know, just internetarchive.org, great source of information. And a lot of the photos, some of the photos in my presentation and photos of properties that were incorporated into taken by the Water Commission, the properties can be seen online on the Digital Commonwealth website. So that's another great source. Hands Across the Valley Quilting Guild. So I am not a quilter, I confess. I know very little about quilting. Everything I've learned has been since I became interested in this quilt. And I'm so grateful to Hands Across the Valley Quilting Guild and wonderful Jane Crutchfield, who has given lots of great information about quilts to me. We had a great conversation on the phone. We met at the Big E. And thank goodness for the Mass Quilt Documentation Project. Are you familiar with that project? Thank goodness that they are preserving the memories of these quilts. They're documenting quilts and keeping track because quilts are women's history. And when they're gone, they're gone. Yes, Jane. Fabulous. So if you're interested in joining, please talk to Jane. So in my research, and here's another shout out to your wonderful organization and the show that's going to be taking place on May 3rd and 4th at Hampshire College. I was lucky to meet Holly Alt at the Pelham Historical Society where she was giving a presentation, a demonstration on quilting. And Holly gave me so much information, so much inspiration, and all the women, well, quilting women are just, it's a special breed. They were so helpful to me in my research and encouraging me to keep going with the research, learn more about quilts. It's a wonderful world of quilting. I have not yet dipped my toe into the world of quilting myself, but I do suspect that it is in my future, and I do look forward to going to that show. So another person I have to thank is Lily Pierce Coolidge. So this photograph, I just am so captivated by the people in this photograph. And it turns out they are people that are involved both in Prescott's history and also in the quilt. In the middle here, the young woman is Lily Bell Pierce Coolidge, who she's a young woman in this photograph, but she will grow up to write the history of Prescott, Massachusetts, a fantastic resource for understanding the people who lived in the town of Prescott. I'm so grateful to Lily for writing that. Now, the woman in front of her that's her mom, and her mom is Ellen A. Pierce. Ellen Amelia Pierce married Daniel Pierce and became a double Pierce. In Prescott, there were a lot of Pierces, P-E-I-R-C-E, P-E, and spelled the other way, I-E and E-I. And I believe there's even a few other spellings. Some are related, some are not related. It's a whole world of Pierces that just can make you crazy. But that's Ellen A. Pierce. She was also a historian. And so Ellen was the mom, Lily is the daughter, and then when Lily grows up, she'll have a daughter, and she names her daughter Ellen in honor of her mother. So those three generations. Lily Bell is her name, Lily Bell Pierce, before she got married to Harry Coolidge. She's in the quilt. We'll talk more about her, and as is her mother, she has a square in the quilt. The guy in the back there looking like a young Jerry Garcia is that's Daniel Pierce. And I just find his look really intriguing, but not nearly as intriguing as the Rasputin looking guy in the front, who is Dr. Walter A. Clark. And I'll be talking more about him as we go through this presentation. I just wanted to show you this picture, say thank you to Lily Pierce Coolidge. And keep that picture in mind because later on we'll be talking more about these people. Eleanor Griswold Schmidt. The Swift River Valley Historical Society owes so much, and the memories of the people of the Swift River Valley owe so much to this woman who has done so much in preserving. Not only did she purchase the quilt and bring it back home, but she's responsible for the Memorial Day celebration and the Dana Vespers and many of the other wonderful, amazing programs that are presented to honor the people who lost their homes. And I love this quote. She says about the museum, "Now I have two beauties, one to remember and one to enjoy." And of course, Elizabeth Zib Pierce was just a driving force behind the preservation of the memories of the Swift River Valley. And I love this, in her obituary, it mentions that she loved Haagen-Dazs dulce de leche ice cream. Whenever I taste that ice cream, I will think of Elizabeth Pierce. both for the good work she did, but also she had an amazing spirit. She was just full of life and vivacity and passion for keeping these memories alive. And then Helen Canny, who did a lot of the preliminary research. And this quote, to me, was kind of a message from the past. You couldn't get this many Yankees to work on something like this without a common purpose. Getting together to make a quilt is really a very special undertaking. And this, and Helen Canny was a member of the Prescott Historical Society and the Swift River Valley Historical Society, who really was another driving force towards preserving these memories. So most of you, I think this is a room full of quilters, and I'm not sure who we have online, but you probably already know that people make quilts for many different reasons, and they make them out of many different materials. A lot of what determines what the quilt will be made of is what resources you have. So if you're in a poor town like Prescott, which never even got electricity and was a very small and poor rural farm town, you might make your quilts out of fabric that you have laying around, extras from things that you've made, or clothing that you've turned into quilting fabric. If you're more wealthy, you might go and buy quilting fabric that came from the factories in Lowell, for example. Or if you were quite wealthy, you might purchase fabrics that came from Paris, France. But most of the quilts in this area, in the Swift River Valley, I think were of humbler origins. A quilt is always a statement of love, pretty much. Would you agree with that? It's a labor of love that is made for somebody, usually as a gift. It could be a celebration of a wedding or of a birth. A quilt can be made to say goodbye to somebody who is beloved, who has to leave their home. And there are so many reasons why people make quilts, and every quilt has its own stories. Quilts can also be used as fundraisers. And this is an idea that really intrigues me. I love the idea of having my name in a quilt that would last for over 100 years, that people would see that we got together and we made this quilt for some person or for some reason together. And so people could pay to have their signature in the quilt, and then they could either raffle off the quilt or sell the quilt. So it could be also used as a fundraiser. So I'm so lucky to know about the Massachusetts Quilt Documentation Project. It was here that I saw that the Swift River Valley Historical Society has not just that one quilt that I'm interested in, but has over 20 quilts. I think there are about 25, and they're all documented, and you can look at them online. They're there at the museum in storage. There's not really space to have them on display all the time, but you can visit them online thanks to the Massachusetts Quilt Documentation Project. And while I was looking through these quilts, even though I'm not a quilter, I couldn't help but get distracted by some of the quilts in our collection that are of particular interest, such as this one, which is made out of, hello, welcome, come on in. Made out of fabric samples from potential dresses that Mrs. Lincoln was to wear to the inauguration ball. So this was a donation from Mrs. Goddard, who, through a friend of a friend, was able to get the scraps of fabric that were, and this quilt is not completed. It's just a small fabric quilt, and it's framed, and it is available to view at the museum. So that, when I finish the research on the signature quilt, I'll go back because this is a really interesting one to look at. And then this one also was of great interest to me. This quilt was made by members of the Prescott Golden Rule Grange number 52. And this quilt was made in 1916. So 20 years or so after the signature quilt that I'm talking about. This quilt was made by people that were members of the Grange. And the names of the Grange members, there's a lot of similarity between the names of the Grange members in 1916 and the ones from 1895. The children, the brothers and sisters, some of the people were remarried. And going through, I was able to match up quite a few of the names. So this gave me a hint, and I was thinking that maybe this was a Grange project. So that led me to further research about the Grange. Here are things that we know about the quilt. We know that it was made in 1895 because people put the date on it. According to the documentation, it is called a snowflake pattern, and I've learned today that patterns can have different names regionally. Different people can interpret the pattern in different ways, but according to the documentation, it's a snowflake pattern, 6 rows of 5 and 5 rows of 4 blocks with the names. It's 84 inches by 106.5 inches. And it was registered with the Quilt Documentation Project in 2002. So this is a map. I love maps. I started a map club. I could just look at maps all day. But I wanted to give those of you who are not so familiar with the area an idea of where we're talking about in the Quabbin, where these people came from in Prescott and where exactly that is. So this is a large map of the whole Quabbin area. And the area that I'm most interested in is the west branch of the Swift River, and particularly the northern end of that area. I started as a Shutesbury person. I was a library trustee, and I became interested in a library trustee who lived in Shutesbury 100 years before me. And her name was Laura Berry Barnes. And I started researching her and her family and her neighbors. And I got to know a lot about the people who lived on the Shutesbury side of the west branch of the Swift River. And then once I started going to the museum, I was able to learn all about these people on the other side of the river in Prescott. So the other map there, it might be a little blurry, but that shows a close-up of the area that we're talking about, where most of these people came from. North Prescott and Atkinson Hollow is the area. So the hints and clues and the previous research, I was so indebted to Helen Canning for this map of the quilt. She graphed it out and she wrote all the names, and she assigned them, row 1, square 1, row 1, square 2, etc., so that I could really see the names on this quilt to really, where do we even begin to do this kind of research? So then I think it was Jane actually that suggested laying it out on the floor. What I did was I took the information that Helen Canning had on each of the 50 names of the people in the quilt, and I laid them out on the floor and read them all, and I started reading who was related to whom, how are these connected, and having this visual just kind of helped me begin to wrap my mind around who were these people in this quilt. And then this is a terrible slide, but I also did it as a database, a spreadsheet. And I also printed it out, and I have the names in alphabetical order. So that's for handy reference. So if somebody says, oh, do you know Ellen Coolidge? And I can just go under C, oh, Ellen Coolidge, of course, she's square, whatever, and have the information that way. I'm not knowledgeable about quilts, and I'm not a historian. I'm not a professional historian or an archivist. I'm kind of learning as I go because I'm just curious to find out these things. At the Swift River Museum, there's so many fabulous photographs. And this is a photo of the Atkinson Hollow area. And I'm so intrigued by this little village, this little area. In the front there is Atkinson Tavern. which still exists today. It was one of the buildings. It was moved to Startown down at the Big E. And I was so excited this summer to actually visit the actual Atkinson Tavern, one of the buildings that they were able to move. The Grange Hall is in this photograph, and the town hall. I forget which is which, but they're all in there. And I have a close-up. I just feel like when you see a photo like that, you can really imagine what it was like to live there. You can imagine the people walking to the library or going to the Grange. The Granges are amazing. Granges stand for progressive, agricultural, social, educational, and moral uplift. Purchasing power is one of the goals. People come together, they get through the hard New England winters, they help each other out. Granges have dances and parties and theater. They put on theater performances and lectures. It's a way for people to get through the hard times of life, living in a small, poor community. I'm hoping this Prescott 1895 signature quilt, I'm hoping it's part of the Grange because I like the idea of the Grange so much, the Grange and what they stand for. Here's a photo that I found in the basement, in the archives of the museum, of the Grange. And this shows it kind of maybe in its last days, but before it was taken over by the Water Commission. You'll see in the next photo, once the buildings of the Swift River Valley were taken over and when they were photographed, there's something about them. And that's the photo that was from the Digital Commonwealth of what the Grange looked like in, I think this was like the 1932 or so, early 30s. It just looks so, I don't know, sad and abandoned and lonely. And as somebody mentioned, the Golden Rule Grange, number 52, was the oldest in the valley, organized in 1874. And the Grange, you'll see, was important because when the Grange ceased to exist, it seems as though, from my research, that the Prescott Historical Society, a lot of the same people went from being Grange members to being Historical Society members to preserve the memories. And then the Prescott Historical Society later merged to become part of the Swift River Valley Historical Society. And here's a photo. Again, I'm grateful to, I think it was probably Elizabeth Pierce who transcribed the names that were handwritten. We all know that we can't read handwriting anymore. It's a lost art. So they were typed over. And this is this is the last Old Home Day in Atkinson Hollow. So a lot of these people, so this was in 1931. So a lot of these people were probably the descendants of people who had created the 1895 quilt. And there's a close-up. I take my magnifying glass and I love looking at the faces. These are just the people, and they look sad, but people in old photos tend to look sad. But I think these people might look a little extra sad because they knew that this was their last gathering as the town was disincorporating. Okay, on to happier news. So some of the people in the quilt, the first person that I was interested in, I saw the name Annie Berry, and I was like, Annie Berry, I know her. She's one of my people. Well, it turns out there were two Annie Berrys in Prescott. There were not only two Annie Berrys, there were two Annie L. Berrys. Oh. So this is the rabbit hole that you face when you start doing research. This Annie Berry was the daughter of John Berry, who was known as the largest man in Prescott, weighing over 350 pounds. This Annie Berry, her brothers, her brothers were Monroe, who moved away, Henry, who was the town librarian in Prescott, Charles, who we'll meet later on because he's also in the quilt. Let's see, Monroe, Henry, Charles, and Frank, I think. I could be wrong on that, I forget. but Annie Berry was from the Berry family. So it's the same berry as the Shutesbury berries. That's hard to say, the Shutesbury. Okay, so my person that I call her my person that I've been researching is Laura Berry. And her father was George Berry. And I believe George Berry and John Berry were cousins. So their children, Annie and Laura, were second cousins, I think. That's close enough. So the Shutesbury berries and the Prescott berries were related. And this Annie Berry is one of the ways that I started to open up my understanding of the families on both sides of the river. And there's a photo of Annie Berry that I came across. It's so much fun doing research at the museum because you're flipping through information and then you come upon a photograph and the person really comes to life. So we had the square and now we have a photograph of Annie. And then I just took a little information about the Berry family, and I'm just sort of collecting all that information. The next person that I was researching, so Helen Canny did a lot of the research and she started with her family members. Oh, this one was my great uncle, this was my grandfather, and she wrote down that information. You can see in her handwriting. She got to Mrs. B.T. Cummings and she was not related to Mrs. B.T. Cummings. And so she's asking people, Annie LaPlante thought maybe this was Mrs. Betty Cummings, blah, 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 blah. So she had some preliminary notes, but she didn't know who this person was. Then in that middle square, on her notes, this is Helen Canny's notes where she was just scribbling things down. And at the top of that page, she wrote Byron S. Cummings. Well, when I saw the name Byron S. Cummings, I know that guy, Byron S. Cummings. His mother was Emmeline Pratt. Emmeline Pratt had two children, Byron and Emma. Emma lived at the poor farm in Shutesbury for all of her 46 years. Byron was adopted when his mother remarried Mr. Cummings. Byron was adopted by Mr. Cummings and became Byron Cummings. And then he married Mary Nettie Cummings, who was also a Pratt, a distant cousin. And so I feel like this is the place where I was able to further the research that had already been done by Helen Canny. I was able to find out more information about Byron and Mary, his wife. Now, here's another example of, so my person that I was telling you about, my person that I represent when I talk about history is Laura Berry Barnes. So her name was Laura Barnes. Her birth name was Laura. So her name was Laura Barnes. And here we have this family, the woman before she was married, this is where names get so confusing for women. So this woman was Miss L.S. Pierce. Well, I was able to find out through this information that Helen Canny left that she grew up and married Allie Barnes. So Miss L.S. Pierce became Laura Barnes by marrying Allie Barnes. My person, Laura Barnes, married Allie Barnes's brother, Herbert. So this is another example. Laura Barnes lives in the Shutesbury side and is married to Herbert Barnes. And Laura Barnes, who used to be Laura Pierce, is married to Herbert's brother, Allie, on the Prescott side. So this is another example of just jumping over the river and different people. And wonderful, I was able to find a photograph of Laura and Allie Barnes, and they adopted a young woman, and she's also in that photo. And let's see, they were good friends of the Newells, and the Newells are also in the quilt. So I'm starting to get to know some of these families and the people in the quilt. Aha, here was a mystery. So most of the names in the quilt are either individuals The women's, sometimes the women went by their names or by their husband's name, Mrs. C.W. Berry, something like that. This is the only one that's just initials, V.C. And Helen Canny had no clues. She had no idea who VC was. Okay, here's another mystery. So I went through the books that I had. I went through the Coolidge book. I went through Donald Howe's book. I went through town reports looking for somebody whose initials were VC. I thought Clark and Coles and and all these names, couldn't find it, couldn't find it, couldn't find it. But then, aha, let's see, I'm gonna skip there. Dr. Walter Clark, remember him? The one that looked like the one that looked like Rasputin, exactly. Dr. Walter Clark married a woman named Verena Glore, and so she became Verena Clark. Now, I don't know for sure that she's the VC in the quilt, but it's certainly, from everything I know about the people in the quilt and how a lot of them were related, family, and that this one is different in its format, and nobody so far has known who the person is. And the fact that Verena Glore was from Switzerland, so, she was kind of maybe an outsider. I'm thinking that Verena Clark is the VC in the quilt. And this Dr. Walter Clark guy is such an interesting character. He was the last doctor in Prescott. He had been an engineer, a machinist at an engineer company in Chicago. And then he went to medical school and he was the doctor in Prescott. And he purchased and lived in Atkinson Tavern, which is the building which is now at Startown. So it's all sort of coming around connected. As I solved this, I think I solved the mystery of who VC was. He was quite an interesting figure. I found an article, an old newspaper article from 1949. They thought he was the only man in Prescott, or one of the few that played violin, and he repaired violins, and he was very well known for this skill. And then he died alone. His wife died before him. And Warren Tolman is a name. There are a lot of Tolmans in the area still, and that's a name that I recognize. And that was his nephew who he was living with at the end. But it really makes you think about the stories of the people and where they ended up after they were forced to leave their homes. This one I love. I'm sorry that the photo isn't better. That's how it was in the files. But her name is Susanna Hunt Fish Haskins. I just love that name, Hunt Fish. She was, so her maiden name was Hunt. She married a guy named Fish, and then I guess he died, and she married Shadrach Haskins. That's also a fantastic name. So I don't know a whole lot about her, but she was, I believe, a great aunt of Helen Canny, and there's a little bit more information about her in the museum. And this lovely woman is, well, when she was born, she was Fidelia Wheeler, which is also kind of fun to say. Fidelia Isabel Wheeler Haskins. And she also, I believe, she was my great aunt. So when you're doing research, try not to use the word my, because the person reading it needs to know who you are. In this case, it's Helen Canny. So she was Helen Canny's great aunt. And I don't know too much more about her, except that she was considered quite a beauty. And she is, oh, here it says, beauty in disguise, a Hilltown belle of the 80s. Here's another one. This one, I really enjoyed her signature. And another thing that I've learned about signature quilts is that they can be embroidered or they can be inked on. This quilt, they were embroidered on, and they could be the name or they could be the actual signature. And in this case, the people actually wrote their name and then it was embroidered on. And it's just so clear. Mrs. Abby Shaw, does it say May 1st? Yeah, oh, year, 1895. Yeah, so this square struck me, you can really see the fabric and the signature really well. And of course, Haskins and Shaws, those are two names that I can't even begin. There are so many Haskins and Shaws in Prescott. I have to stop my research someplace and I draw the line at Haskins and Shaws for the moment. And here again is Ellen A. Pierce. And this square I thought was something about the colors were just kind of soft and particularly lovely. And she again is the mother of Lily Bell Pierce Coolidge, who wrote the history of Prescott. Now we come to Lillian Gross, whose poem I read at the beginning, and there's the poem up there. So Lillian Gross and Fanny Gross, I love those two names, and I'm pretty sure they were sister-in-laws. Fanny married Arthur Gross, and I believe that Lillian was married to Austin Gross. I'm pretty sure that's how it was. But these two seemed like real characters, full of life. They participated in the quilt. They were members of the Grange. Most of the people that I came across were members of the Grange. And as I said, the Grange did things like put on plays. And there's one of the Gross girls in a performance. And here's Lillian and Austin Gross at their home on Fish Hill in Prescott. And there's the playbill for one of the performances. There was a lot of fun and lightheartedness, as well as just community at the Grange halls. So this is another picture of, this is the Pomona Grange. So there would be gatherings of different Granges where they would get together and have a celebration or a party. And this is an earlier photo. I don't think we have the date of this one, but you can tell it's quite a bit earlier than the photo from 1931. And people do seem a little bit happier, I think, in this photograph. And I'm pretty sure that even though we only have a few of the names that somebody wrote on the side, and sometimes those names, you know, people remember later in life, oh, that was so-and-so, and they're not always right, but any hint is helpful. So as I get to know my people more and more, I'll have this as one of the photos that I'll refer to try to match the people and their names. And this guy, this is Henry White, and I was just going through photos from the Prescott box, and I saw this picture of this kid. Something about him just grabbed my attention. I wanted to know more about him. His face, I don't know. It's so compelling. And then there he is as an older man, and his face is like exactly the same, but older. And there he is as a baby. And as I went through my research, I learned that he was actually one of the people that was instrumental in the transition from the Prescott Golden Rule Grange to the Prescott Historical Society, which was formed in 1932. And then it was later incorporated into the Swift River Valley Historical Society. So he was one of the people that was really instrumental in bringing the memories forward. And there is a photo of the quilt. It's a little bit more of a close-up. But I do want to invite everybody to come to the museum and see it for yourself.